Thanks, Greg, and thanks everybody for being here. I can say from my own experience, finding the bathrooms in the Red Halls is kind of difficult. I think I had to walk around at least twice. Maybe my vision is just bad, or that just contrasts with the blue that I'm wearing. Anyway, I'm a Seattle native. I went to Garfield High School. I went to the University of Washington, so it's really nice to be able to come here and give a talk at the library. Kind of fun. Anyway, as Craig said, I got my master's in computer science from the University of Washington. I now do research in artificial intelligence, which is this whole other bell and whistle that I'm not really going to get into tonight. But I'm going to be talking to you about digital privacy, which is quite interesting. As Craig, when he introduced me, mentioned digital security. So we're going to dig in a little bit to the machinations of what these different words mean and how they impact what we understand as of hacking or identity, what is conjured up when we imagine our lives in the digital realm, and how that might be obfuscated by other technologies or organizational structures. So again, you may have learned from my background that I have a tendency to use words that some people don't understand and to discuss concepts that certainly I don't even understand all the time. So I would appreciate if you have any questions. We're a pretty small group here. The talk is being recorded. That's the somewhat ominous device in the center. So, be aware of that. Speak loudly. I'll try to repeat your question. And just interrupt me if you feel the need to with a question. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So I'm going to lay out my talk a little bit. First, I have to discuss the framing of digital privacy. I'm going to dive into it to a little greater degree as we go on, but let me just introduce the concept. Craig mentioned hacks and whatnot. I would deliver a large one that many of us may have heard of that occurred in the late 2016, or we learned of it in late 2016, particularly around the US presidential election, the one that Trump won. In this hack or scandal, data from some 90 million Facebook users was harvested. That sounds like a lot. Facebook actually has 2 billion users, so it's a subset. And these data were used to target advertisements and nudges, various behaviors online to influence elections. Most notably, as I mentioned, in the US presidential election, but also in Mexico slightly after. Cambridge Analytica describes the firm that was involved in the collection of this data. You can see here on the right an email from the release of that, which describes many of the different characteristics or data gleaned from the hack, including IQ, gender, age. Some of these seem more dubious than others. Many of the technophobes have a tendency to proclaim their ability to predict more than they can, but they at least have some of these things. So I bring this up not just to harp on Mark Zuckerberg, although I love to do this, as you can see him in the right here testifying before the Congress, which was a result of this investigation. I bring this up to ask, what's going on? How does this relate to our lives? What are the motivations? Why would you want to gather the data from 90 million different Facebook users and sell it for advertisements? Okay, well, maybe you would want to influence an election. That seems interesting. That's an obvious one. What are more pervasive, more subtle mechanisms? How does it happen? What is the actual mechanism through which a hacker or even someone buying data is allowed to do so? And what does it say about these terms that we use like privacy and security on the web? I'm not going to answer these questions right now, and I may not even be able to answer them tonight. I hope that I, through the course of this talk, will be able to deliver, some pictures in the dark of this. But let's keep it on our minds as we go through. Okay, so a little bit more about me. I've pictured here a picture of handcuffs, and I'll get to that for a second. So as I mentioned, I got my master's at the University of Washington at UW, and I was a TA for the computer security and privacy class. It was a fun gig. I did it because I could get free tuition and not do that much work. But I also found the content really interesting. And one of my roles was teaching sections. I taught a lot of starry-eyed kind of engineering folk students. And one of my favorite lessons was lockpicking. We were trying to do this as an analog to describe how things work in the digital realm. Of course, in our lockpicks, there was also a pair of handcuffs. Handcuffs, very similar. The mechanism is actually quite easier than a roll and tumble lock. being the somewhat precocious and fairly self-aggrandizing TA that I was and probably am, I locked myself in the handcuffs in front of the room. You know, everybody, I'm sitting there, I'm kind of cool. I was wearing, I think it was a Tuesday, I was wearing a Hawaiian shirt. And so, tropical Tuesday. And I unlocked myself, right? I did it a couple of times. They oohed and ahed. I discussed some stuff about computers, blah, 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 blah. Until, and I think that you should be realizing that there's an until in this story. At the end of the class, a student broke the mechanism in the lock and couldn't get their handcuffs off. It was quite disappointing. I had to call the police. You know, there I am beating in sweat as these two burly police officers, one of them having already broke through his plastic gloves in an attempt to put a shim in between the, you know, the mechanism right there that unlatches them. Anyway, we got them off, and I guess you might be wondering why I'm telling you this story. Well, there are a couple of reasons why I'm telling you this story. I will use, and throughout the talk, a number of analogs to describe security. I think they're quite useful as a mechanism to show the man behind the curtain, who's the, you know, the Oz folk. But also to say, don't trust me with handcuffs, probably a bad idea. Our best security mechanisms and, conversely, our understandings of privacy always have loopholes. You just have to call a police officer and have him break a pair of plastic gloves. And that high tech, you know, this idea of digital security, of hacking, of all of the things that I'll mention, for all of its bells and whistles. It's a very human endeavor, and at some point, there are people doing these things. Okay, are you with me on that? So, I may present a vision of the world where people dancing and frolicking and doing things like that, in contrast to the world that people like me, or trained in computer science, or thinking about advertisements on the web, attempt to imagine, or rather the world that many of us imagine in terms of cyberspace, you know, pictures of cubes and of matrices and whatnot. And to harp on the example that I've already mentioned, this metaphor is slightly inaccurate. The idea of a disjunction between the digital world and the physical world, and between, you know, us dancing and enjoying ourselves, and then suddenly I'm checking my phone because somebody sent me a text, or I'm calling an Uber, etc. They're much closer. There's a much more human element, which is why I picture here Matthew Broderick in War Games, looking kind of stupefied. I think he looks somewhat similar to me. I'm not suggesting that I'm Matthew Broderick in War Games, nor will I solve any national security issues, but that, as I said previously, there are humans in the loop. There are many examples through this idea of cyberspace, through this overreach of the digital world, begins to interface with our lives. The fact of checking your phone when you're, you know, out dancing with friends, while in this day and age may seem normal or just an everyday occurrence, begins to appear slightly extraordinary when we compare it to the types of behaviors we may have engaged in 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. We can notice how the digital world extends its claws to a certain degree in our lives, how its overreach influences our actions and behaviors, not only through security or through criminal mechanisms, raising questions of identity, as Craig mentioned, but also of, well, I guess identity in the, you know, who am I, what is myself type of question, two definitions of the same word. Okay, so I return from that framing exercise, a number of extended and slightly warring metaphors, to talk about the function. I think as we discuss digital privacy and digital security, really as we attempt to understand the world, it's important to have a model for it. It's important for us to understand, you know, what is it like? Many of us may think of, this is an image of global temperatures increased over the past 100 years. Many of us may think of global warming, a phenomena which is quite complex. It's really hard to understand. We don't know what our roles are in it. I would say that it's actually quite dissimilar to how the technical world operates. That the technical world is not a complex problem, but rather it's a quite complicated one. And complicated in the sense that it is decomposable into very understandable and practical parts. In this way, it's much more similar to, you know, building rockets. There's a person behind every aspect of this rocket that's built, and we did it quite a long time before we were able to solve climate change. It's very similar with the internet, which may appear like this kind of weird squiggle and lots of little dots. This is actually a diagram a couple of years ago of all of the different computers on the internet, or some level up. But as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, it's just a bunch of links. The internet, as its most basic function, is our connections, either radio waves from our cell phones to a Wi-Fi router, for example, or to a cellular tower, or wires, copper wires, various types of wires that connect computing devices. So I offer a much simpler diagram, the decomposition of that complicated problem into a slightly more simple one, where we can see a number of devices called clients in this image connecting through the internet, which again is just a series of other wires and computers to a server. That kind of makes sense. It's a lot more simple. This is how I think of the internet, and I might be one of those people with accolades and bells and whistles and whatnot. So I presented a little bit of a narrative of the internet, and I think it's important to understand how this works so that we can understand how we work with it. Well, we might be asking why this is how it is. We probably could ask these guys. It's a bunch of old white men. I'll be one of them one day. And they're the creators of ARPANET, which was the United States, I think it was out of the Department of Defense, first version of the internet and how it worked. So we could probably ask them and say, why'd you create it the way it is? And effectively, they'd give us two reasons. Two reasons from their initial design to the design of the internet that we have today. And it's really technical feasibility. A series of, oops, we broke it, like a number of various security mishaps in the 1990s, and money. These are the, at a rough level, things that drive how the internet operates, and therefore how many of our lives are changing to operate in a similar manner. Technical feasibility and money. Okay, so as we begin to think about this a little bit more, I want to dive into services that operate on the internet. So as we understand the internet merely as a series of pipes to a certain extent, we may be asking, well, what about those things that are manifest on the internet? What about when I think of the internet, Google or Facebook or many other internet services? Well, these things are also understandable. They're driven by people at the end of the day, and we can understand their motivations in some level. I would posit that they would involve two different things: money and things that become money, are how we begin to understand how the services on the internet run, what allows them to occur. I would maybe ask a question to the audience. How many of you pay for your internet bills? This is somewhat a tautological question, I guess. What about for your devices? And also a raise of hands. Do you think then perhaps we can answer this question. Isn't the internet free? I mean, we download these apps on our phones. I've pictured 4 or 5 of the top apps from the iOS App Store from a couple of days ago. They're all free, it says free. I mean, they should be, right? It's often the case that people say that no, if an app or a service that you're using online is free, you're the product. I think that this is actually slightly inaccurate, and I'll get into that to a greater degree. But they're not free. They're falling into the second category that I described, which is not money. You may not be paying for something. As you visit Google, you're not handing them over money. You're handing them over something that becomes money. And this is how I pictured here Facebook's earnings from 2017. They get so much money. We can see in over the 5 quarters listed, or we could just do 4 for the worldwide. Facebook is making about $20 a user. In the United States, that bumps up to about $70 a user. So in effect, there's some sort of algorithm. There's a black box. You know you're visiting Facebook, if you have one. We're all living in the United States. And you're not giving them $70, right? I haven't given Facebook $70, but I'm giving them something. And that something is becoming $70. And it's quite interesting how it's becoming $70, because it becomes a question of, as I mentioned in the beginning, what are these 90 million users with information on Facebook and Cambridge Analytica doing things with it. Why is he testifying before Congress and making all this weird stuff in the world? Well, he has a lot of money, and it's useful to understand how. So I have another sort of silly chart, which is quite reductive and perhaps does not explain everything. But it's a chart of how to make money on the internet, for how does a service, rather, make money on the internet. There's the easy one. You can ask a user for money. On Amazon, you pay for a product, and they take a little bit off the top. Or you could literally ask for a donation, right? This is simple. You get that. You could ask an institution. So, for example, when you visit the Seattle Public Library website, you're not paying for it. Well, you're not paying for it at that moment. You're paying for it when you pay your taxes. And then the taxes go to the library, and then the library pays for the computers which you visit. Or they pay Amazon to pay for the computers which you visit, or something like that. Well, the point that I really want to get into today, and that I think has a lot to say about these ideas of security and privacy, is the third category, gathering user data, in particular behavioral data, and I'll get into what that means. So the way that we turn, or one way that we turn user data into money is through ads. We've seen these. We can go on Facebook. Maybe we even have an ad blocker. And there are various types of ads in the internet. And we can, to a certain degree, it's a little bit grainy, I know. But to a certain degree, we can look at how they've evolved over time to understand and correlate to the increase in money. So in the 1990s, there may have been a lot of static ads, similar to what you would have seen in a newspaper. It's not really about you. It's something that could pertain to you. But then as we see the rise of Google and various other services in the early aughts, there's an increased targeting of these ads. It's suddenly the idea of, I have watched a cat video on YouTube, and therefore I see ads for cats, or something similar to that. And then there's a third category, which I'm not going to get into too much, which is a more predictive sense. I'll mention that just in a minute. Okay, so to this idea of various ways to make money on the internet, does that make sense? Okay. I would also posit that it raises a few questions. How is it that the big ones are so big? I just mentioned Facebook's earnings, and I told you that there's some sort of way that they turn that data into money. They turn some of these things that we saw previously, like location, it wasn't included in the email, so I added it. That's a big one. Openness, a degree of openness, your conscientiousness, like extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, life satisfaction, IQ, gender, age, political views, jobs, self-disclosure, fair-mindedness, self-monitoring, sensational interests. Wow, I think they might know more things about me than I do. Well, if we posit that they're able to actually learn these things and it's not just a bunch of hand-wavy magic, there's certainly some of that, I'm quite alarmed. I didn't really think that I was giving Facebook this information. Maybe the age, okay, I remember typing that in, and my gender, yeah, okay, I put in male, and my job, okay, sure. But neuroticism, I don't think that they asked, are you neurotic when you sign up for Facebook? This is what I'm beginning to point to in that third category of advertisements. So not just demographic, not just are you a resident of Seattle, do you have a job, but things that you have not, data that you have not provided, data that you may not even know about yourself. And this raises some interesting questions about privacy. I mean, I said that I was pretty up in arms or alarmed at the types of things that Facebook might know about me. Here I've pictured a painting. Really, I don't know what it depicts, but it looked like a guy looking over a fence, so I thought it applied. Privacy is a kind of weird concept. Many of us use the term. I certainly do. But it's quite situational. I think that there are a number of different types of privacy. There's a cultural definition of privacy. As you talk to different groups of people, they may have different definitions. Some may be less or more alarmed by that list of categories that Facebook knows about you than I. In fact, I think the common Mandarin word for privacy didn't have a definition in a dictionary until the 1990s, for example. There's a legal definition. in the United States, our legal definition of privacy dates back to laws around advertisements, around government surveillance, many of these being read out of the Fourth Amendment, I think, occurring in the 1950s. There's a technical definition. I won't really be getting into that too much. But it's important to think about how privacy as a term can be weaponized and changed and subverted such that when we say, I really care about my privacy, my value of privacy, this cultural understanding that I have about it, and then in response, a company says, no, no, your information is private to us. It's a little bit different, right? They're still using the same word. Okay, so back to this model of the internet. I have this emoji. It's actually an emoji in the lower right-hand corner of a building that's supposed to represent institutions or kind of like companies. And I put them near the server because that's kind of where they're sitting. It's like Google. You could imagine that building as Google. So what happens when you visit a website? How are they kind of doing this thing? How does the collection occur? Well, I now zoom in on the computer. They send you information, and you send them information. I can get into the specifics, and a couple of people in this room could as well. One of those ways that they send information is cookies. I've pictured a very tiny cookie, the same tiny cookie, and then a larger version of the same cookie. A cookie is a useful manner to describe data sent by a server or a service to a user that's stored on your device. So, for example, when I am going around Amazon.com and I've selected, oh, I want to put bells and whistles in my cart, and then I go later to the cart and I want to check out. Well, they had to remember in some way what is the thing that I was storing, so they might say, oh, Jared wanted bells and whistles, and then it's like written down in a file on my computer. This is one example of how websites may begin to track the type of information. You can imagine on a large scale, then Amazon somewhat clearly has information about all of your browsing history on their website. There are many other examples of trackers, which is the broad category of technical manners through which to learn about user information. Cookies are just one, and they're slightly being phased out in terms of understanding how users get around. I could talk about them more, but mostly I wanted to show this picture of a cookie. So if I, for example, visit Zappos.com, right? I wanted Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star Core High. I didn't know that was part of the name of the shoe. My friend just got these. They're pretty cool. Let's say I do that. And then, as is probably the experience of many of you, I visit CNN. You may notice that this is a different browser. It's because I took these from the course that I was teaching, their slides. That's okay. And then you can see the ad pictured in the right-hand side of the Zappos.com. And again, if we visit The Onion, you can see the ad for the Converse in the top. This ad is tracking us around the internet, perhaps because of cookies, perhaps because of a litany of other trackers, which is effectively to say data that you send to the services that they kind of shuffle behind their backs and tell each other about. Okay. One of those ways, in addition to cookies, that they might be doing that, are these little like buttons that appear all over the internet. You've probably seen them on videos or on articles or whatnot. There's a Facebook like button right there where you can like The Onion. And as we begin to, as we return to that idea of Cambridge Analytica and to their understanding of, for example, your political leanings, I think there's maybe something you could say about political leanings and The Onion. When they embed that little like button, suddenly Facebook knows that you visit that site. Facebook, through what is called a third-party request, the first-party request being I send a request to The Onion for their webpage and they send it back. A third-party request is I send a request for that little like button from Facebook and they send the like button back and they take the information that I visited The Onion. That's another way that these internet services may learn a little bit about you. Okay. So let me present an example of a type of advertisement or a type of learning that occurs on behalf of these internet services through the massive accumulation of this type of data. You know, this is just one example. Do you have a question?
Yeah, just for clarification, if I visit The Onion, even if I don't touch that like button, Facebook still knows that I went to The Onion?
That's correct. So what's happening is that websites are much, much more complicated than even I ever thought. When you visit the website, it's not just I'm going to the Onion and saying, give me your web page. It's I'm going to the Onion and they give me a mostly done web page, and then there's a bunch of other stuff I also have to get. So I get all of the images from the Onion, and they say, oh, but you also have to get this thing from Facebook. And then I go to Facebook, and I get the thing from Facebook, and et cetera. This is why sometimes when you're loading a browser on your computer, it can take a long time and not guess appropriately. Does that make sense? There are ways to combat this, but it's an example that's somewhat useful for our purposes. OK, so as we begin to think about this types of information that services can learn on a massive scale, let's imagine that you're a pregnant mother. You're going around and you're buying vitamins, or you used to buy alcohol online and you stopped doing it, or you're looking up neonatal care books, or you are thinking about buying a crib. These are things that mothers would buy. There's this really interesting series of articles from this organization, Coding Rights, about chupadados, which kind of means data sucker, and which they talk about the manner through which these internet services are able to target ads at pregnant mothers, following them around the internet. Many advertising studies will show that women, while pregnant, are the most susceptible for changing their buying behaviors, and therefore have ads targeted at them at a much greater degree than other populations. So this is, as I described previously, that third category, this new type of ad that is quite predictive, that may be learning things about this that we haven't told, that we may not even know about ourselves. It's a gathering user data part. Okay, so as we understand this idea of privacy, of how our data is used online, I'm going to return to this model of the internet and introduce two more emojis. These emojis are a flaming red light and a spotlight, or a magnifying glass. The magnifying glass is meant to represent kind of state intelligence, or like the government, and the light is criminals. So if we think about the tubes of the internet, we have our little computers or various clients on the left trying to access some sort of service on the right. There are many mechanisms to get through those pipes, and this is where we introduce the term of encryption, or encrypted traffic. So if you are sending information across the web that is unencrypted, some of the following might happen to you. This is an installation that I created. I think, is this video playing? Ooh, maybe next. Oh, there we go, it's playing. This is an installation that I created to try to think about some understandings of user privacy. I was going to create this here, but it was going to be too much of a hassle. So for example, if you open your phone and you were visiting a website like, well, you have to connect to the Wi-Fi network. Okay. I should have known. I made this whole thing. You visit a website like IMDb. What can happen if there's somebody along that chain, they can notice that you visited IMDb. So the point of this installation that I made was that to grab all of the traffic that you made on a Wi-Fi network and show you the websites that you're visiting. You can notice that that person had an iOS device, an Apple device, and that was running Safari. These are some of the types of information that are automatically sent as you visit websites on the internet. And unencrypted traffic, as that visit to IMDb would be visible by anyone along those chains of pipes. That's why we introduced the idea of encryption. You may have seen, as you're browsing the internet, HTTPS. That means that last S is for secure, which is encrypted effectively. And it's one of the mechanisms that we can try to beat those state intel and bad guys. Okay. So I've talked a little bit of the technical mechanisms of how the internet works, perhaps in a slightly boring manner. Perhaps we don't care about how the internet works. But what I get most excited about is a return to, conveniently, I placed this slide in before Craig mentioned, a dichotomy between security and privacy. So these oftentimes when we think about the digital domain, we use the term security. Security often evokes the idea of keeping your things secure, keeping them encrypted, for example, unable to be read by eavesdropping parties. And then privacy is this idea of something more cultural, trying to have in accordance with your understanding of browsing the internet, for example, or walking around with your phone in your pocket, the use of data with your actions. And I would say that while for security there's much agreement, many companies want this, they don't want criminals to be stealing data, to be doing things in the middle. In fact, you can't even do that installation I had previously because most websites are now encrypted and it's fairly irrelevant. There's much more work to be done in privacy because I would posit that many of you tonight may not know the extent to which information about you is being sent through the web, through the internet, and might not be happy with the manner through which it's done. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of more examples and then try to synthesize some of the things that I've said tonight. I talked about trackers, right? I talked about various mechanisms through which services learn about you. In fact, a study done by some folks that I know in 2011, which is a while ago, found that on the top 500 websites, the most frequently visited, there were some 457 of them embedded at least one tracker. That's something, an attempt to figure out where you are. Half of them embedded between 4 and 5 different trackers, that's distinct from different websites, and then one domain included 43 different other ones. This is kind of interesting. It tells us that, I certainly in 2011 wasn't aware of this, there are many things occurring in the digital domain that may not be visible to us. I may be visible to the fact that I'm using Facebook more, that I may have a sleeker, faster phone, but I may not be visible to the extent at which these services are able to iterate, to build upon themselves by the fact that I'm giving them $70 of data worth a year. We can look at a lot of these trackers over time, up through the year of 2016, and begin to get a better understanding of really how did they get so big, which is this question that I raised in the beginning and that I'm trying to answer. Let me know if you have one. In fact, you can see this big graph, this big line on the top is from Google Analytics. This red line is from doubleclick.net, which is owned by Google. This line here is from google.com. And I think that equals some 40% if we don't assume too much overlap, which means that Google is on 40% of the top 500 websites, meaning that for the top 500 websites, effectively Google knows that you're visiting them because as you visit them, you're also saying to Google, hey, I visited this website at this time with this browser running this kind of computer with this sort of display. So as we begin to think about which number is Google in the world in terms of most profitable companies, I think is it 3? We begin to be able to answer the question, why is Google number 3 on that list? Well, it's not this Google Glass stuff that they make. It's really not even their Android devices, which they sell at almost a loss. 90% of Google's revenue comes from ads. Their ads are powered by this, by all of the websites that they collect data from. This also just demonstrates that the number of trackers included by websites has been increasing over time, from almost none in the late 90s to almost 30 for the top 500 websites by 2016. Okay, so this is kind of weird, troubling, and you may not even believe me, right? I've shown you a number of graphs from researchers. So for the purposes of our interest, I was going to show you, what's actually happening when you're going around the internet. Does that sound reasonable? Okay, cool. Right. So I'm going to open Firefox, which is a browser, like Chrome or Safari or something like that, and I'm going to visit a website, and we're going to see what happens when I visit it. Okay, I'm going to choose CNN.com because I know that they load a ton of trackers. So if I load CNN.com, it looks kind of normal. It actually doesn't have any ads because I have an ad blocker that I'll demonstrate in a moment. But Firefox has this neato feature built in where you can actually see the trackers that are built in. Hey, somebody else is using this word trackers. I'm not. It's kind of cool. You can see that CNN loads something like, I don't know, that looks like 18 or so different trackers, distinct. And how many different cookies? Oh, they look like they have 13 or 14 different cookies loaded on their website. We begin to get a picture of why those numbers are so big. Does anyone have a different website that they think that I should visit to check?
Whitehouse.gov.
Ooh, Whitehouse. Unfortunately, whitehouse.gov is one of those websites that the institution pays for, but we'll see. I don't know what happens.
They probably don't redirect from HTTPS. They might require it.
Yeah. You're right. Okay. Oh, come on. Yeah, I don't know.
Used to work when Obama was president.
Okay, here, let's see what the whitehouse.gov is loading. Well, they only have one tracker and only one cookie. Amazon? Amazon conveniently is that one of those first-party trackers. So let's see what they load. No trackers, because you're visiting them and you're already giving them your information. They probably wouldn't want to compete with Google. And a number of cookies. Well, that kind of makes sense. You'll see, in fact, that news websites, so we could also load the New York Times, for example. One of those businesses that really, really survive on ad revenue are exemplary of loading a bunch of trackers. Oh, Google's not, they're not loading too many. A number of cookies. What is another website?
What about Reddit?
Reddit.com? Yeah, let's check it out. Mostly just cookies. Oh, let's see. Oh, they are loading. Ooh. Okay, Google, Amazon, Google, Google. I'm not sure. QuantServe, Scorecard Research, QuantServe. About 4 distinct trackers. I'm convinced. Okay, let me continue the presentation. Okay, so I've given us an example of the idea of what is happening as we go around the internet, what's being sucked, who is the chupaderos. So I may attempt to present a threat model of the internet, an idea of how do we think about it. I've displayed, again, many of those emoticons that I used previously. In terms of, this is actually something that I was taught, this idea of a threat model. I don't know if the term ex-lover was always used as the least level of difficulty to prevent against. We may imagine this. In terms of how we want to secure our information or data online, there's a kind of logarithmic increase. For preventing against an ex-lover accessing your devices, you may change your password from password to I hate you, Jen. You know. For preventing against a criminal, that might not be good enough. You might have to go for something like a couple of numbers in there, perhaps an underscore. We're not sure. For protecting against state intelligence agencies, I often use the Mossad as an example. They're Israel's state intelligence agency, known for really extreme measures. You really can't do anything. So that's sort of the example of levels of difficulty. On the other side, advertisers sit mostly in the difficulty level of preventing against criminals. It's possible to prevent against them. It's not as difficult as state intelligence agencies, but they pose a number of questions in that approach. Okay, so as I've discussed today, I've talked a lot about consumer examples. I've talked about how is my life affected by this? Maybe my experience on a dance floor is slightly less. I have to use better passwords for my ex-lovers. But I would actually like to hearken to a much more serious example as we begin to think about digital privacy. Because while it may affect me slightly poorly, it affects other people in countries like Mexico. This is the wife of a slain journalist in Mexico who was targeted by advertising software made by an Israeli company to learn information about her. This is the state-level intelligence emoticon, should be on the right. Oops. That attempt to gain access to her phone by sending her malicious texts. So there are many more serious examples, which I won't delve into to too great a degree. In fact, I talk more about the capitalistic model, about the idea of information as something that leads to money and power. And I may, in that approach, hearken to somebody that talked about this a lot. So if you'll excuse me to read a quote from a guy named Lewis Mumford, who said that capitalism turned people from tangibles to intangibles. The economy of acquisition tended to replace the direct economy of needs and to substitute money values for live values. The whole process of business took on more and more an abstract form. It was concerned with non-commodities, imaginary futures, hypothetical gains. We can think of this as easily hearkening to, for example, the predictive ability of these companies to know if you're pregnant, to know when you want to buy the next thing, to send you to a certain location as you're using Waze, because they know you can't resist McDonald's when you're driving past at Saturday night at 11 p.m. Never happened. What's really funny about this quote, though, is that Lewis Mumford wrote this in 1934. And it was about the kind of capitalist overreach that was occurring with regard to industrialization as having occurred in the past few decades. A more salient example, although not too much more salient example, at the modern day is provided by Shoshana Zuboff, who describes surveillance capitalism, what I've talked about today, as a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw materials for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. This is the model through which they got so big. It's why $70 worth of my data is going to Facebook every year, why Apple is the most profitable company in the world, to some degree. In fact, it's interesting to think about the subversion of this as we think about these different definitions of privacy. I talked about it earlier in that guy peering over the fence. In fact, some people are saying Apple products are designed to protect your privacy. This is a screen grab directly from their website. And we're beginning to notice the commodification of the cultural value of privacy. It is suddenly the case that since I can pay, $1,000 for a phone, and Apple says that they're not going to comply with the FBI unlocking them, then they can capitalize on that market. And we begin to see a stratification, in fact. Apple devices cover something like 2 or 3% of the number of mobile users in the world, while Android devices, which have a much more pernicious collection regime, are being used to give internet access to the next billion, for example. This describes a number of the requests that Apple has assiduously received and denied from the internet to access various pieces of data about the device, the financial identifier, account identifier, and whatnot. Okay, I've talked about a bit of a synthesis. I've given us an idea of not only the technical models behind the functioning of the internet, nor a proof by example of that, but also an understanding of the capital models, of how the money flows in addition to the information. So now I provide something that is slightly more concrete, and hopefully that you can come away with tonight, are a number of tools. That's probably a good idea. I'm a technical guy. I like my shiny things. But first I present you with a comic. And I'll read it out loud so that we can all appreciate and bask in the glory of it. I am Mordak, the preventer of information services. I bring new guidelines for passwords. It reads, all passwords must be at least 6 characters long, include numbers and letters, include a mix of upper and lower case, use different passwords for each system, change once a month, do not write anything down. The other man says, squeal like a pig. Have any of us received feedback like this on how to choose our passwords? I certainly have, yeah. I don't think people do this, right? In fact, I have information to back up that people don't do this. There was a big hack in 2009 of a company called RockYou, and fascinatingly for internet researchers, we can see all the passwords that people used. So in ranking 1 through 10, and then the number of users with the passwords on the right, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 had 290,000 unique users, which is actually an order of magnitude more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not sure. That extra 6 is really secure. Wait, password is good, capitalized. Princess, RockYou, the name of the service, that's a big one. And so I've pictured down in the bottom right the emoticon I'm using to represent internet criminals to give you an idea of how maybe changing your password can prevent against them. In fact, there are tools to help you pick a better password. I would say that if nothing else from listening to me talk for 40 plus minutes so far, you should use a password manager. At one point, I wrote a short story about, it was a projection into the future. What's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years? And one of the things that I said somewhat dystopically is that my mother is still not using a password manager. She was the administrator of a school and is like one of those people you really want to use secure passwords. And there are a number of different examples for these things. On the left, I've shown you LastPass, which is a free service. There are built-in examples on Apple for Google Password and other similar ones. But this is really, it makes it easier. You don't forget your passwords. And they're fairly secure. Again, for those threat models that we talk about, not secure against the Mossad, but pretty good for most cases. Another thing that you can do on the more capital model of how the digital realm is encroaching on our lives is try to prevent the tracking, right? As a fellow in the back asked, well, what about that like button loading on those web pages? Does it have to load? In fact, no. Many of the different browser extensions that you might use, like AdBlock Plus, I've pictured here on the left uBlock Origin, or NoScript or Ghostery. There are a number of examples of these things that you can use in conjunction with your web browser. So that's like with Chrome or with Firefox to try to prevent against this tracking. In fact, as I was giving that example demonstration, Firefox has begun to incorporate many of these mechanisms internally. Firefox is the cool browser, in my opinion. It may not be everyone's opinion, but they actually do, given that their open source background. I don't work for Mozilla, which is the parent company. They attempt to highlight and design for users' privacy to a much greater degree than the third or fourth biggest most profitable company in the world.
So I have a question.
Please.
Google, which is an untrustworthy company and has stolen our data for years, if they have a password manager, what would stop them from, mining their passwords and they're storing it on their computers too, so we don't even have it necessarily. It's stored in the cloud.
So
Why is that secure?
It's a good question. I think that we have to return to that idea of threat models. Right? So if I went back to password managers, I haven't pictured the little emoticon that was a building to represent companies on the lower right hand, because really this is most secure against ex-lovers and internet criminals. That's the point of using a password manager. Your question alludes to a more complicated interface, but in particular, it's in Google's best interest not to share that information that they have about you with other people. I mean, because they earn less money about it, but also because it looks really bad and you'd probably stop using their services. And this is how they begin to subvert the understanding of privacy. They say your information is private, and it is. They're not giving it to other people. But you might not know that they have it, or you might not be comfortable with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that. I just
Totally. Okay, so there are also a number of other examples of tracking protection that might occur on the system level. If you have an iPhone, you probably have seen this previously. You can see which applications on your phone are accessing your location. This is a really profitable piece of data, and you can turn it on and off or discriminate. You can do the same thing on Mac OS. On Android devices, there are similar types of protection available, etc. And then as we return back to that idea of sending information through the pipes of the internet, we may be thinking about secure messaging. This is actually a really good mechanism to even prevent against state actors, as I've pictured in the lower right, and represented with a lock and speech bubble. These are examples of like secret messages on Messenger, which is owned by Facebook, or all of the messages on WhatsApp, or messages on iMessage, or on services like Signal. The idea is to make it so that not even the service can see the messages that you're sending. So this is often called end-to-end encryption, encryption being the process by which your data is sort of locked or mathematically operated upon so as to be only decipherable by the recipient. And this changes point-to-point messaging, which might be like SMS, for example. When you send an SMS to somebody, it's not encrypted. You can see it at every point along the way. It just so happens that the people who own all of those points along the way aren't sharing the information with everyone. Does that make sense? Okay. There's also another type of tool called the multi-factor authentication. You might have heard of this as described as 2FA, two-factor authentication, or MFA. I don't have them on me, a couple of keys that serve as a type of multi-factor authentication. And I pictured on the left this code generator. You might get codes sent to your, on SMS to your phone. Along the lines of that secure messaging talk, it's actually the case that many employees being sent to some countries in the world are told not to use multi-factor authentication with SMS because the pipes in those countries are not as secure, the internet pipes, that is, in so much that you can be hacked more easily. But it's pretty secure in the United States, so you don't have to worry about it that much. You could also use a number of other tools that have fancier sounding names and worse user interfaces. These tools include virtual private networks, which are called VPNs, encrypted email. I've used a diagram for that. It doesn't really matter what it says. Peer-to-peer social messaging, networking. Like, forget Facebook. I'm just going to use something that's completely different. You could use distributed file storage or an internet browser that's called Tor, which just means the onion router. These are really not so useful unless you're trying to subvert state actors. Or, yeah, Helen? It describes a somewhat complex mechanism through which no central authority has information about the social network. So that it would, instead of the model of device connecting to server, it would be device connecting to other device. Yeah, question in the back.
So you say these things aren't useful? I hear VPN all the time.
They're quite useful, but they are more complicated to use, and so the use cases are more specific. So thinking about using a VPN if you are often in using public Wi-Fi networks and running unencrypted traffic on your computer, so visiting HTTP-only websites, then you might want to think about using a VPN. Companies themselves host VPNs because they have more users. They're trying to prevent against criminals to a greater degree. On the individual level, unless people in your field are talking about using these things, it's probably not like that useful to use them. Does that make sense? Okay. There are also other tools like antivirus and identity protection. These are kind of the equivalent of like a less good version of the Plan B. They don't address the problem. They address like side effects of it, and so they're not so useful. Okay, I have just one more kind of fun example. How many of us here have a phone that you unlock with Touch ID? Touch ID? Many of us? So what's funny, in the United States, this begins to answer that question of the legal definition of privacy. The contents of your mind is a legally protected class. The government is not allowed to compel you to divulge the contents of your mind, but they are, if you've ever seen a movie of somebody being booked, allowed to make you divulge the contents of your fingerprint, right? You know, that kind of makes sense. As we begin to think about mechanisms through which to subvert the state-level incursion in privacy, you would want to think again about using Touch ID on your phone, because that can be easily compelled in the United States, for example, while a password cannot. Kind of fun fact. Faces also, you know, they're allowed to take a picture of you. Yeah. Yeah, please.
You know, on a lot of devices you can use a design on the number pad. How does that
I think I'm not a lawyer. Yeah, this is not legal advice, but I think that would probably be contents of your mind as well.
That's what I think too.
Yeah. There are also a number of advocates in this space, right? It's not so much that we're groping around in the dark of this digital realm. There are people like John Steinbeck, who talks about the Dust Bowl and the movement of farmers into California who try to advocate for us. In fact, he described in a much similar way to how we think about internet services in a discussion between a banker who is repossessing somebody's property. We're sorry, it's not us, it's the monster. The bank isn't like a man. Yes, but the bank is only made of men. No, you're wrong there, quite wrong there. The bank is something else than men. It happens that every man is a bank. Every man at a bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men, I tell you. It's the monster. Men made it, but they can't control it. As we think about the types of services that we use, in fact, even the people who are representative of those, people like me, I guess, we may recognize the modern day corollaries of what Steinbeck was talking about. We may think about muckrakers, or not muckrakers, fact finders. This picture on the right is by Jacob Riis, who took a number of photos in the era of industrialism, as Lewis Mumford was writing that quote earlier, of tenements in New York City, trying to display to the world the horrifying nature of them. So I, in an attempt to hearken to Steinbeck and Riis, present a number of other advocates. I mentioned the Mozilla Foundation previously, that the folks who own Firefox. There's also the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, various researchers, the ACLU. These are folks who are trying to think critically about the technological means through which these services operate, the capitalist means through which they accumulate, and then the people behind them. In fact, there are, I think, probably more accessible versions of this, like, for example, the Privacy Project, which is a series of articles that the New York Times began to publish in early April, not very long ago, asking questions like, does privacy matter? I think so. And indeed, even in the Washington State Legislature, there's a bill that's currently being debated, last acted on, I think, in late March, that attempts to say that Washingtonians cherish privacy as an element of individual freedom, that Washington is a technology leader on a national and global level and recognizes its distinctive position in promoting the efficient balance of consumer privacy and economic benefits. Hey, it seems like somebody's trying to, align some of those different definitions of privacy that we have. Although the ACLU in response said that it has a flawed structure that vests control over data in the hands of companies who can override consumer consent and control over their data. I guess the picture is a little bit more complicated than we thought. But it's useful. I mean, there are folks that are debating this, that are attempting to advance something like what Europe has in the General Data Protection Rules, or GDPR. And it is through these mechanisms that we might arrive at a better accordance of privacy. That the fact of another New York Times article published in early April that tracking phones, Google is a dragnet for the police, we see a confluence of those two different threat models. The fact that Google has 40% of the top 500 websites information about you, that has your location data because you're using Google Maps to get around a city you don't know very well. And now when the police ask for all of the devices that have visited a certain geofenced area, they fairly willingly divulge that information. We begin to question that model of, well, it's just my location, or it's only some information about me or some photos I posted on Facebook. The picture becomes a little different. Indeed, the picture kind of becomes like these handcuffs that I presented in the beginning, which I bring up again to reinforce the fact that you shouldn't trust me with handcuffs, that we should think about our best security always as having loopholes, that high tech, for all of its bells and whistles, for all of the folks that created ARPANET, the old white guys, is a human endeavor, is interfacing with you. In fact, all of this information that we have about Cambridge Analytica came out because a guy named Christopher Wiley, I think, spoke out about it as a member of the firm, started contacting the New York Times. So it's through these kinds of human efforts, through using tools to protect how the information about us is shared, by vesting our hopes in advocates, the modern-day Jacob Rieses, that we can attempt to define a concordance between cultural, at least my own cultural, values of privacy as it might relate to security. I'll take questions in a minute, but that's the conclusion of my talk. So I have another demonstration that we can do that's not really necessary, but how about I just take questions and people can filter out if they need to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear from your talk what the dangers are of having our privacy unprotected.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there might also be some benefits. For one, like I don't have to look at ads that don't relate to me. I can get relevant ads
Mm-hmm.
that I want. Can you play devil's advocate for a second and talk about what the trade-off is by protecting your own privacy, maybe costing ourselves convenience?
Yeah, I think that there's a big, this is often something that's discussed. I didn't mean to too great a degree advance one alternative mechanism. I think that mostly I'm attempting to be descriptive in the sense of this is how things function, this is how information is used, and that there are opportunities to find alternatives. So certainly those alternatives may cut down on convenience. Using Apple Maps is kind of worse than using Google Maps because Apple has much less location data about you or is less willing to use it to make their services better. And perhaps in the self-determination that we engage in a society, we're okay with that. But as it stands in my mind, I'm not the one deciding that when we vest our information, or $70 worth of our information in Facebook on a yearly basis, it becomes them that decides. I think much more interesting is not so much the conclusion, but rather, is the process democratic? How are my own values advanced? Are there, in fact, attempts to subvert and change over time those values that I hold, to engage in a kind of neo-colonialism through the use of digital means in other countries as well? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I totally agree that there's some sort of trade-off available, and I think that's that's something that I'm working with to the greatest extent. I'm at the moment working on research projects for alternative funding models for some of these services, and I would like to incorporate a variety of stakeholders in that research. Yeah, in the
So
best.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, please.
We want to work for companies that are going to protect us. What's their benefit? Why are they going to do it?
Why will a company protect you?
Yeah, why is a company going to put out billions or millions or whatever to give an alternative to these other guys that are making money,
Mm-hmm. Well, So there are 2 points that I would have with that question. One is that the definition of the word protect is quite ambiguous, in so much that it's protect from whom and protect what. So as I was talking about previously, it is in Google's best interest to protect the data Google has about me from other people, to make it so that it's not being spread around the internet beyond the ads that they sell, because Google wants to profit off of it, and because it makes Google look bad if it leaks out. But secondly, there are people that are attempting to subvert the kinds of massive data collection. In fact, as I pictured, Apple's marketing strategy to a great degree is predicated on the fact of that. It's the idea that, well, some people kind of get huffy about this privacy thing, and those huffy people seem to have enough money to buy these fancy phones, so, well, let's appeal to them. And I don't mean to cheapen it necessarily. Like, that is a mechanism through which we can have privacy. But as I attempted to elucidate with my mention of those journalists in Mexico, we can begin to see the emergence of a new kind of class of privacy. The idea that the bourgeois, the moneyed classes, have access to it to a much greater degree than many others. That it's a sign of a kind of wealth. And I think that's kind of troubling as we think about in what I often think about as the foundation of a just society.
I just want to comment.
Please.
You mentioned Cambridge Analytica, and I believe it was an English woman named Caroline who did the work to break that story. But I didn't research for our topic today. Not some guy who just did that.
So that Christopher Wiley was the inside Cambridge Analytica guy that I think he released the information. He didn't write the story himself.
There was a woman who extensively researched it and made sure that it was in the English press before the New York Times ever did anything about it.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't know her name. I'd love to learn it. Thanks. Do you have a question? Yeah, please.
I have been using Google Chrome as a browser,
Mhm.
so there is an option to search as incognito.
Mm-hmm.
Do they still gather information about you if you do the search?
So the idea of incognito, and you may see this in Firefox private browsing, Safari has a similar feature, is it does nothing to change for the most part, does nothing to change the information that the service sees about you. They can still see that a computer with a certain IP address with a certain type of browser on a certain type of operating system is accessing their information. Private browsing, to a greater degree in Chrome, means that it's not going to be saved to your history. So when you look, oh, what are the web pages that I visited today? It won't be listed there. Or it might not save a cookie, or it might not save a cookie permanently. So it's actually quite different. Firefox, to a greater degree, is interested in changing that idea. So in how they approach private browsing mode, they're attempting to, in fact, prevent some of those trackers, like the like buttons that we talked about and the cookies. But no, private browsing mode does not prevent against tracking. Yes, in the back with a white shirt.
Can you explain briefly what blockchain is and what you think the future of that?
What could the end of the question?
Future of blockchain.
Future of blockchain. That's a great question. In fact, I think is there a blockchain workshop coming?
We had one last month.
Yeah, so I think there must be a video online about about blockchain. I would definitely recommend checking it out. I think that they probably have some interesting things to say. But more seriously, I think that blockchain describes a distributed ledger. You can think of an Excel spreadsheet, for example, as a type of ledger. I write something down in a series of tables. A blockchain is merely a verifiable or version of that, such that each row corresponds mathematically to a function of the previous row at a very simple level. So it's really just a technical process that can be applied to a number of different problems based on needs.
I know in your talk about information, you didn't say too much about IPs, but if I'm not mistaken, IPs can be pretty well geolocated, right?
I think decreasingly so. They're well geolocated. But yeah, I mean that's one of the ways that location is gathered. Also through Wi-Fi, so that the entire like being connected to Wi-Fi is like a Wi-Fi network as opposed to cellular LTE makes it easier to geolocate.
Didn't Google Maps for a while ask you to turn on your Wi-Fi network?
I think they still do. Yeah. And it does make your directions better, right? They are able to figure out the location better. And so as the gentleman in the middle asked, the service is better if they're able to give you this information. But the trade-off is you're sending them hyper-local location. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, Craig?
What about like the MAC address? So,
Mm-hmm.
because I've heard that someone can find the IP address, and they can find the MAC address, and they can find your whole search history.
So MAC stands for
Machine address.
machine address code.
I think so.
It's effectively a unique identifier. So in the factory, when you're making your computer or they're making your phone, there's a big machine that's stamping each thing. This is what I think about it. I think about it like license plates. It's much smaller, and it may be happening digitally. But that's information that's sent across, for example, on a Wi-Fi router. What's happening is that I'm saying, computer 1234556 wants to send this kind of information. Wi-Fi router, are you listening to me? Are you listening to me? So it is being sent out as you travel the internet to some extent. I don't know. I think it stops at the router. So you could imagine in a very secure situation where you don't want to have that information sent out at all, you probably would not want to use the internet. It's kind of one of those things that you can't use the internet without. But that's a good question. Yeah, in the front with the white shirt.
So I guess, what if I'm somebody who doesn't really care about ads? I'm not really worried about trackers following where I'm going because they just don't really bother me. What are the greater things that I should be worrying about? And are there greater things I should be worrying about due to this tracking?
Do this tracking. So I think that this is the illusion I attempted to provide with the Google use of your information. So if we believe, and I believe fairly well, that Google has good information about my location, it begins to take on a different light as we think of its interface with state intelligence, for example, as we think of our liberties and rights with respect to due process, and the idea of I didn't want to, the state should have to have a warrant to understand where I was at a certain location, or they should at least be tailing me. They should at least have to incur a lot of money to do that. And through current mechanisms, they can't. That would be one example of a class of manners that you might want to care more. You might also want to care more because it's a cultural phenomena because many other people care about it because it's, I think because of those two reasons. Does that make sense? In the back in the jean jacket.
Do you feel like companies in the future would have like an obligation, either ethically or legally, to make people better informed about how their data will be used?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, as a researcher in at least adjacent to digital privacy and security, there's a lot of talk about this. In fact, I taught an ethics class at the University of Washington to computer scientists. I'm going to speak to a bunch of philosophers about it next week. I'm pretty scared. So there's discussion happening. I don't know if that means that anything changes because it is literally the capital model of these companies that they want to collect information about you. So absent a different funding model, it's really not in their best interest to change that. As things are currently going, no, I don't think so. But you could imagine alternative services that begin to exist. And that's some of the things that I'm trying to think about. How could we raise that idea of institutional services? So as we think of things as utilities or as public goods to a greater degree, how does that change our understanding of the manners through which they function? It requires advocates and to comment, for example, on that recent bill in the Washington legislature. So the idea of ethics being sufficient, I think, is inaccurate, but it's a good starting point. It's a good place to think, well, what are my values? How do they correspond or not with these services that I use? And then how can I, through legal mechanisms, through technical mechanisms, and social ones, advance them? Go ahead.
Would you imagine like a regulatory body that would govern them instead of asking the companies to govern themselves?
Yeah, I don't want to advance a specific type of regulation at the moment because it will just, it's not my ballpark necessarily, but we can hearken to the general data protection rules, which exist in Europe. They were passed in 2016 and just came into effect in March, I think, or last March? Last March. As a type of regulation that attempts to advance understandings of privacy or uses of data. So for example, there's a right to be forgotten in the GDPR where you can have all of the information that these services have about you deleted. And then they have mechanisms to enforce that. You know, you can go to court. That's largely how it occurs in the United States. That would be one example. Does that make sense? Yeah, and the white shirt in the back?
Yeah, if I go to like a friend's house and log on to the Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
look at all the websites that I read, does my friend have any way to figure out the websites I visit?
Definitely. So that might be the case when you want to use a VPN. Because then what happens is you'll be using all of your information will apparently be going to the VPN, and then from there it could go to other services. But more seriously, that's kind of the coffee shop model. If there's a malicious actor in a coffee shop, can they see where you're going? How can you subvert that? And there are many other corollaries of the same thing. Yeah, Craig, you have a question?
All right, so you're in a coffee shop.
Sure.
You're here in the library.
Mm-hmm.
You're logged into your hotel. Should you not visit your bank? Should you?
So that's a great question. The answer is no. Like you should just mostly browse the internet as you would normally because that S has been added on the most of websites because we have HTTPS and some other more complicated mechanisms to secure internet traffic, which means that while it might be apparent that you're visiting a specific website, the people on the Wi-Fi network or the router can see, oh, you're going to google.com. They can't see like which part of google.com you're going, and they can't see information that you're sending necessarily. So it's much more secure than it was previously. There used to be a browser a couple of years ago. I really wish that I had been a researcher when this was around, called Firesheep, where you could just it was an extension. You could run the extension and then sit in a Wi-Fi hotspot and then log into other people's Facebook accounts as they sent their information unsecured over the internet. So like it's way better than that. You can't do that anymore. And that's why the installation that I had effectively doesn't work anymore because most websites are encrypted. There are a couple that aren't, but they also are the ones that don't matter. Yeah, and the denim jacket.
I know there have been moves to try to increase access to technology and connectivity, especially in lower income contexts, especially outside the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit on trying to mitigate the issues with security and equity when the low income context can hold more access to lower security devices.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I mean, it's a lot of what I've done research in. So I used to do research in effect of the neo-colonialists, the people, I actually don't, I think that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, of how can we use technologies to bring people out of poverty, for example? How can the idea of predicting crop yield improve the amount of money that you have? But as the converse of that, what are the implications of being internet connected, of playing a role in this new capitalist dynamic? I don't have all of the answers to those questions to a great degree. They're very complicated. I presented that somewhat, that decomposition in the beginning. I'm still in the process of decomposing that problem. And I There are many that I would say are good examples, primarily in the areas of public health and agriculture, where we can see the use of technological and computational devices elevating the capabilities of people. But when Facebook attempts to install their services on all the devices in India, and then India like freaks out and bans this service, we can see something a little bit more similar to what you're beginning to talk about. And that happened 2 years ago. All right, any other questions? If not, we're just about at time. So thank you, everybody.